Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graven. Our guest today is Marc Lesser. He's the CEO of ZBA Associates, an executive development and leadership consulting company, and he's a Zen teacher and coach. So Marc founded and was CEO of three highly successful companies. He has an MBA from New York University. Prior to his business and coaching career, Marc was a resident of the San Francisco Zen Center for 10 years. And he was the director of Tassa-hara Zen Mountain Center, the first Zen Monastery in the Western world. So before I tell you a little bit more about Marc, first off, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Great. I'm doing great. It's good to see you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I think we have a lot of interesting topics to explore here today related to different aspects of your career. But let me tell everyone a little bit more about you first. So again, Marc Lesser, he helped develop the world-renowned program called Search Inside Yourself at Google. It's a mindfulness-based emotional intelligence training for leaders, which teaches the art of integrating mindfulness, emotional intelligence, and business savvy to create great corporate cultures and a better world. Marc is the author of many books, including most recently, Finding Clarity, How Compassionate Accountability Builds Vibrant Relationships. And he's host of a podcast called Zen Bones, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Times. So, Marc, normally we jump right into the favorite mistake question, but first I'd like to ask, one question kind of about your background. If it's fair or accurate to describe you as a former monk, and, I think we can explore this more later, but can you sort of summarize a little bit about what that was, what that means, what that is?
Yeah. No, my 1 year leave of absence from Rutgers University when I was, in my early 20s turned into 10 years of living at the San Francisco Zen Center. My parents not thrilled about this. They would have characterized it as worse than a mistake, but in fact they sent someone after me to rescue me from the cult, and of course that person ended up becoming part of the Zen Center as well.
Oh. Wow.
And to answer your question more specifically, yes, during 5 of those 10 years, I was a monk in that I was living in a monastery. But this was California, so this was, people think of different images when they think of monasteries. This was men and women and children and families. And at the same time, it was a very arduous schedule that included a 3:40 a.m. wake-up bell every morning.
Wow.
And lots of meditation. So it was interesting that the combination of traditional schedule, but very non-traditional makeup of who was living there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we'll come back to that later on, because I'm guessing, I don't know for sure. It doesn't sound like that was your favorite mistake, going to the monastery. No. So instead of guessing or presuming, let me just ask it as I should. Marc, with the different things that you've done, different aspects of your career, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
Yeah, the one that comes up for me was, after my 10 years, I went to business school and I started a publishing company company called Brush Dance, that we made greeting cards and calendars. It was a company that I started literally in my garage and grew it. And my favorite mistake, I would say, was avoiding having some important and difficult conversations, not avoiding conflict, which led to me being fired from that company that I started.
Oh.
Ouch. Yeah. Wow. And that was an enormous lesson. And interestingly enough now, Mark, it's something that I find myself teaching a lot. And in fact, this new book, a lot of this book is about avoiding conflict is trouble.
Yeah.
And that was a clear big mistake, was avoiding some of those conflicts and difficult conversations, and things got really wonky in my company, and and I was rather blown away and surprised when my board wanted to meet with me and to tell me that it was time for me to leave.
Wow. what was an example of one of those difficult conversations or topics or potential conflict points that you were avoiding?
Yeah, I would say, it's interesting, the line between, on the one hand, we were going through some turbulent times, as businesses often do,
Mhm.
and there was some, disagreement around strategy, around some decisions. But I would say that some of my key employees were crossing the line about disagreeing with me, and then there was, I would say, a line of disrespect,
Mm.
and I think they then even took it further, right? So, and I think they could see that I was not stepping up to having some of those hard conversations with them about their behavior.
Um,
Um, and then I think they felt, I think, the freedom to then talk to some of my board members, and there was some, it's interesting. There can be some pretty wonky political things that were happening behind the scenes there. Yeah, so I think had I had the courage and the skill to just have some of those real direct conversations with people that were crossing lines. I mean, in truth, it was probably time for me to leave.
yeah.
Uh, but I wanted it. I think it could have happened very differently had I not avoided some of those hard conversations.
And this was the first business that you started, is that
This
right?
was my first company,
Yeah.
and with my second and third company, especially the company that as you alluded to, I started a company that was birthed inside of Google's headquarters.
Mhm.
And it was there that I made a very conscious decision, promise or vow to myself to not avoid difficulty.
Yeah.
To now, it doesn't mean that I have to, have every difficult conversation, but to not avoid them is a very different thing. And it's interesting, as you were describing this podcast and me. I think maybe even before we got on, I thought, one of the things that, an exercise I do often in the workshops that I teach is I have everyone, I describe how I took some improv classes,
Mm.
partly to help me feel more comfortable when I'm up in front of people. And one of the first things that you do in improv is they teach you to raise your hands and with a big smile say, "I failed."
Huh.
And
Yeah.
I've done this with many, many hundreds, maybe thousands of Google engineers
Yeah.
and other business leaders. And there is something about, having a different relationship with failure, which is what I so appreciate about the work that you're doing here, Mark, on this
Right.
podcast.
Yeah. So tell me more about that exercise. I mean, is that a general statement of saying at something in the past I have failed,
Yeah.
and what thoughts follow from that?
Yeah. So it's, it's lessening one's fear of failure, having a different relationship with failure. So what I do, if I'm doing a workshop with a smaller group, I will then introduce an improv game that in which it's about things happening quickly and in which you will fail. And it's then noticing our usual response and reaction to failure is to tighten because we don't want to fail. So
Mm.
this game is to get more practice at failing and not tightening. And it's a little bit like sometimes what happens is after we do that, you spill your coffee by accident, and instead of like, oh shit, like it's like,
Right.
I failed, and
Yeah.
and I find myself, you know, in truth, we're throughout our day, whether it's in business or in life, there's lots of little failures,
Mhm.
and in some way, I think it's, practice for some of the bigger failures too. Uh, you know, of course, we don't want to fail, and we do everything we can, as we should, to
Mhm.
be successful and not fail.
Right.
Failures will happen, and it's like, so what? It's this game is about shifting our
Mhm.
becoming a little bit more comfortable
Right.
relationship with failure.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's really interesting, and I've tried to develop some of my own methods of again, either just acknowledging a small mistake, or soothing myself, or reminding myself it can be okay. And I think when we have a more positive, when we're able to have a more honest relationship with small mistakes, I think there's less denial, there's less cover up. That if we address the small mistakes, in a lot of cases, we can prevent the big catastrophes. What are your thoughts on that?
No, definitely. Well, especially, things like avoiding conflict, right? So what I think often we avoid and avoid and avoid, or because we want things. I think we humans habitually, we want things to be okay. We don't want things to be falling apart.
Right. Right.
So it takes it for a lot of people. Many of us are, I would say, conflict avoidant. Don't like to face difficulty. Don't like to face maybe other people's mistakes, other people not living up to their commitments, not being accountable. So that was one of the big lessons for me, was that will get me into trouble, avoiding those smaller, those what look like smaller mistakes. It's funny, in the world of Zen, there's an expression, that the life of a Zen teacher is one mistake after another.
Yeah.
There's also, Mark, an expression, a tiger catches a mouse with its full strength. So it's a little bit like what you were saying. It's like not avoiding those things that look small, like giving everything as much as we can our full attention.
Yeah. So, I mean, thinking back to your story, or even as you're coaching people more generally, what are some of the factors that lead people to hold back? Like, is it what it's fear of the conflict itself, or fear of what the conflict might lead to in terms of relationships or outcomes?
Yeah, I think all those things. I think it's, underneath it, I think, is bringing awareness to that question. Like, what is it? What is that fear? What do I think? What's the worst possible outcome? What might happen? Yeah, I think there's fear that, the other person might be angry. They might be mad at me. They might not like this. But it's like, man, all of those things are, especially in the realm of leadership, we need to train ourselves to have a bit more skill and freedom to be able to have those real conversations. And it's okay if someone might be angry with me. Well, that's okay. That happens. People are going to be angry with me whether I have this conversation or not.
Yeah. So how much of it, I mean, you're talking about freedom and skill. When let's say if you're giving advice to your younger self, or as you're giving advice to others now, how much of like this decision to, I don't know, have the difficult conversation, to not avoid it, how much of that is a matter of, let's say, courage or safety versus skill of like knowing how the best way to bring up a difficult subject, or both?
Yeah. I tend to think in this, in the work that I do, the coaching work that I do, I think there's a presence element to it, right? It's having a body, being able to show up in a way where you're not spewing emotions, where you can actually be more present. And I'd say there is and then there is a skill part of it, having the tools and skills to be able to know that these conversations, that there's a content piece of it, there's an emotional piece of it, there's often an identity. What are my identity issues? Does this somehow involve this other person, or my sense of competence? Competence is a big one in the world of work and leadership. Am I questioning my own or this other person's competence? But again, underneath that all, I think is seeing our own our habit energy, and being able to move from habit and compulsion to more choice, seeing choice and skill, being able to skillfully have these difficult conversations.
Yeah. So you talked earlier about this vow that you made to yourself to not avoid all difficult conversations. I mean, do you have kind of a thought process? I don't know if maybe in Google speak, is this an algorithm? Is it a sense of when to take some action and lean into what might be a difficult conversation?
Yeah, I think it starts by noticing, right? Like I could remember, it's funny how, one of the things I love about this work of, whether we call it awareness or relationship building, we get to practice it in all parts of our lives. And I was thinking when you just asked me that question, like in my marriage, my wife would say something to me, and it might not be till 2 days later. Like, she said what? Like I would. So I felt like part of it is training oneself to be aware and notice. So I think it starts with in the work world, any time there is what I think of as an ouch or some energy that comes up that you feel, that you start. I mean, our bodies are amazing this way. So part of it, I think, is listening to our bodies and training ourselves to be aware of those, especially when we're tightening, when there's an ouch. And then I think it starts there, and then it's having the presence to say, oh, what is this about? And is there a need to have a conversation about this, or is this this is something, this is all me. I can just let this go. This is super interesting, how the different ways this comes up in the work world.
Well, it's not even work world. It can be in
Everywhere.
your neighborhood. I mean, I won't go into all the detail or anything. It's not like there's legal action or anything. It's not that bad. But let's say within a neighborhood homeowners association, you have a board that makes a decision about something that's going to impact the neighborhood. I made a choice to speak up and ask some questions and even challenge, like, why is this technology now? Why is this necessary? I'm a problem solver, so I don't want to just hear the solution. I want to hear the problem. Maybe they're making a mistake, but I'll tell you, I don't regret asking questions, but I mean, I got some very direct feedback in a phone call with the board president who felt like I was questioning their competence when that wasn't my intent. But it just goes to show there's risk in avoiding it. Or maybe I say, okay, fine, it's a little bit of money. I should just put it out of my mind and move on. But I chose to lean into that. I guess I can control my action or my tone of voice. I can't control how someone else is responding to something.
Right. Yeah, I want to underscore what I think of as two core lessons here in this realm of what we're talking about. One is impact is not intention. So the impact is someone does something or says something or even looks at us in a certain way, and we feel tight, or we feel ouch, or we feel like maybe even feel like our competence is being questioned. That's the impact.
Right.
We don't know what the other person's intention was. In fact, I had a conversation yesterday with someone who told me that he had a lot of people over to his house for a gathering, and they got noisier and noisier and noisier, and he started feeling anxious in his own house. And he told me that he felt betrayed by these people who were not paying attention to how anxious he was feeling because of the noise level in his home. And I said, man, probably they were just all having a good time.
Right.
Like betrayed, that's a really strong word. I think you might be weaving a story there about their intention. So we humans, we do this almost unconsciously, right?
Hmm.
When we feel threatened or hurt in small, medium, or large ways, our tendency is to go to blame. Our
Mm,
te- our tendency is to
right,
go to story. So, like in this way, betrayed,
right.
or I mean, this could be right. Our next door neighbor could be playing loud music, late at night, and oh man, I feel so betrayed. Like, no, they're just having a party.
Yeah,
And we might need to go over and say, hey, I'm trying to go to sleep.
yeah, yeah. And they might get upset, but I mean, I guess that's just part of the pros and cons that we weigh in this decision of, do we let it go? Do we tolerate it? Do we say
Right.
something? Do I need to say something versus choosing your battles, if you will?
Yeah.
It's violent language there. Sorry, but
Yeah. I wanted to, Mark, say the other really interesting, I think, of rule of thumb in this realm is that we judge others by the impact their actions have on us. We judge ourselves by our intentions, right? We
mm-hmm.
are all good people. We're all good people. But those others, we judge them by the impact that their actions have on us. Super
Yeah.
interesting, I think, to unpack that.
Well, and you're making me think back to the neighborhood situation. I kind of, I'll recognize I fell into a bit of a trap of saying, well, I didn't intend to upset him. I didn't intend to say you're incompetent.
Mhm.
Um, but what landed was different. And I think of a different scenario. I was more of a spectator to online and professional circles, LinkedIn, um, of somebody. There was a post that offended some women, just in terms of the language that was used. It could have been acknowledged, apologized for, and corrected, but the people involved in the post kind of went on the attack, and they said, well, our intent was not to offend. Now, as an observer to that, not being a direct participant, I even tried to coach one of the people sort of involved in this kerfuffle as someone I know, and I realized this is advice I need to give myself. Like, intent doesn't matter. Nobody knows intent. What matters here is that some people were offended by a choice of words. Okay, I'm going to reflect on that and remind myself of that point. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and these things, these things show up in so many different ways. I mean, I was thinking of I was leading a workshop and I did a short guided meditation at the beginning of this workshop. And one of the things that I did was had people, uh, I brought them to a place of feeling safe. Like, what is it like?
Right.
What is it like to feel safe
Mm-hmm.
as something to practice in meditation? And afterwards, one of the participants was a young black man who told me, I had trouble with your instructions about feeling safe.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel safe as a black man
Mm-hmm.
and it was like, and I had to, um, it was really interesting. And I said, I thank you for sharing your experience.
Mm-hmm.
That we never know. We can never know another person's experience. And this is,
Right.
the first chapter in my book is called "Be Curious, Not Furious."
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I think we should all have that sewn into as a label in our clothing to remember, to be
Right.
curious, especially in these things about other people's experience. That
Right.
it's amazing, right? The same thing can happen, the same thing can be said, and we experience it
Right.
completely differently.
Right. And I mean, I think that's something I've tried to be better about. There's this um what's the right word? I think empathy towards others, that their experiences and perspectives are different. So again, I'm kind of bringing it back to like this online kerfuffle of somebody saying, well, that language is not offensive. Or there was a similar post that some other people had complained about, of like, that's not offensive. That's funny. That's a meme. That's a joke. Don't be offended. And again, I tried to give some feedback of like, I mean, I've learned this the rough way, school of hard knocks sometimes, of like telling people how they should feel just isn't helpful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I often quote. There's a psychiatrist named R.D. Laing, who wrote a book. This was a long time ago. Book what was one of my favorite books when I was in college, called The Politics of Experience. And it starts with, I cannot experience your experience. You cannot experience my experience. Therefore, we are invisible to each other. Now, this is a bit of a cynical viewpoint, but the message underneath it is that we really cannot experience other people's experience. And like what you were just saying, this happens, man, the dialogue online, because we don't have the usual clues of our presence. Things can get off the rails really easily with language and words, and being offended, and but I think underneath it is we have a different experience to language,
and context and medium, and thinking back to this HOA situation, I think a lot of this would have gone differently if I had reached out to the board president, who's a neighbor. I've met him, we're not friends, but to say, hey, I have some questions, can we talk? Like, I think through a phone call, a similar set of questions through tone would have landed differently than just seeing words on a screen. Like, my engineer brain says, I'm being rational, I'm asking questions, I'm looking for answers, not thinking, like, that's going to land differently when someone sees, wow, okay, that seemed kind of curt or aggressive, or like, you didn't thank us for our efforts first. I mean, there was a lot missing in my attempt at a Facebook group communication.
Yes. Yeah. I sometimes use the example of, a supervisor, a boss says to someone who works for them, can you have that report on my desk tomorrow morning? Now, that could be, if your relationship is good, and that could be, oh, no problem. But if you've been late and there's some tension, those same exact words could be taken as, man, he must be really mad at me. That's a real challenge. Why is he talking to me that way? But it's so much of it has to do with context, relationship, the level of trust, the level of curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a question like, is it possible, if it's not too much of a burden, if you don't have other things to do, could you have it by tomorrow, versus thou shalt or else? Yeah,
exactly.
So Mark, you said earlier, well, just double back to where you said 2 core lessons. One, impact is not intention. What's the second core lesson? I don't think we got to that.
The second one was that we judge others by we judge others by the impact their actions have on us, and we judge ourselves by our intentions.
That's right. Okay. All right. That's a great point. That was clear. So so that second lesson. Okay.
It's so interesting, right? Like, even in what you're describing about the homeowners association, or the insanity in our politics, how from both sides, I mean, everyone, we all want the same thing, right? We want to be happy. We want our children to be safe. We're all good, kind people, but then we immediately get into trouble with the way that we judge others.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, Mark, around Buddhism and the little bit that I've read about Buddhism, there's often a lot of discussion about mistakes and kind of, a particular Zen or Buddhist view. I've seen phrases, Buddhists don't sweat mistakes, an emphasis on seeing mistakes as essential, things that lead to learning and growth. I mean, how would you articulate kind of, this perspective on mistakes?
Well, since you're bringing in Buddhism, I think that one of the perspectives that Buddhism brings, which is somewhat radical, is that we actually live in 2 worlds simultaneously. What the Buddhist language, again, they might call it different thing, but there's the relative world, and then there's maybe what's sometimes called the absolute world. Right. So in the relative world is the ordinary world where, a mistake is a mistake. And we do need to live in that world. Now, the absolute world is one kind of stepping back and
Mm,
seeing that um, in the absolute world, everything is just as it is, and that mistake is like a tiny drop in a much larger ocean.
yeah.
So, so the absolute world is a kind of different kind of perspective taking, but it's not about ignoring the relative world. It's like we have to completely live in the relative world, but it introduces a larger perspective around time and space, right? That it's a kind of realization that the way that we think about time generally made up. It was Einstein who famously said, past, present, and future are very practical, but they're made up. They don't
Mhm,
really exist.
mhm.
And and also, we humans are amazing in that in some way, yes, we're in this body, we're in this place, but we have these amazing imaginations and ability to be in many places at the same time in a certain
Mhm.
way. So
Yeah.
so Buddhism introduces a radical kind of perspective taking.
Now, did I make a mistake in sort of combining Buddhism and Zen? You're kind of reacting like, yeah, you did, but no. All right.
No, no, no. Zen is a particular school of Buddhism.
Okay,
There
so
are
that's why
many,
we hear
many,
Zen Buddhism as
right,
okay.
right. I mean,
Okay.
there's Tibetan Buddhism, or there's many other,
Ah,
and even within Zen, there are various schools. Uh, Buddhism itself, the historical Buddha was around in about 500, 600 BC.
yeah.
Zen came into being about 1,000 years later in China
Oh, okay.
in like 500, 600 AD in China. Zen was birthed.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that, Mark. So I was going to ask you kind of your transition then from the monastery to business school. Like, what prompted that? Did anyone try to come rescue you from business school?
No,
Different paths, perhaps.
that was a really hard transition. After I loved my time being at the Zen Center. Um, I think in part turning 30, being married, and also having my son was born all during that time, and I felt like I needed to find out my place in the work world, especially, and what I was going to do for livelihood, and also I needed to kick myself out of the Zen Center. In a certain way, it had become a little small and a little comfortable, and I needed to enter the world of figuring out who I was and what I was going to do, especially in the world of livelihood and money.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was hard going. I went right from there, pretty much right into business school on Wall Street in New York University.
Right.
And it was a kind of learning by fire. But it was powerful, and I really appreciated it. I appreciate it a lot more looking back
Yeah.
at how hard that time was.
Mm. I can only imagine. I mean, somebody went to business school and, think of the different backgrounds and perspectives, and there are certain kind of common backgrounds. You meet somebody. So what'd you do before business school? Someone might say, consulting, investment banking, certainly, I was at startups. And then there's somebody occasionally, like I think of, people from, business school that it stands out sometimes like, oh, that's a very unique, different background. I mean, I'm sure you had a lot of those moments where people did a double take, like, wait, you were doing what, Mark?
For sure. No, and there were some funny times. I remember during that time when I was in business school and I was looking for a part-time job in New York City. I can remember my first resume just very unskillfully just said exactly what I had been doing. I can remember uh, being I was looking for a part-time job, and I was in an office building like on the 43rd floor of a New York City building, and I was in the waiting room, and people I could see a bunch of people were gathered around a desk looking at my resume, and I could hear one of them saying, there's a Zen monk here looking for a job.
Yeah.
And it was not easy. It was
Did you
not
get
easy.
the job?
I didn't get that job, but it's funny.
Mm,
The job that I did get was I had my resume kept shifting and changing, and at one point it became uh, I was the head of human resources for a conference center in California called Tassa-hara, and and I was in a job interview, and this woman looks at me and says, "I know this place. I've been to Tassa-hara. It's a Zen monastery." And she said, I'm going to hire you because I kind
mm,
of have a feeling about someone who's been in that particular uh, institution, organization. So it was a
yeah.
funny time.
Yeah. Well, again, our guest today is Marc Lesser. His most recent book is Finding Clarity: How Compassionate Accountability Builds Vibrant Relationships. I want to ask you, Marc, one thing you talk about, it's a favorite subject and topic of mine, kind of alluded to it earlier, psychological safety.
Mm.
And you say there are three ingredients to finding that psychological safety at work and home. What are those? Or at least some of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Well, I think, kind of alluded to this in something that we were talking about earlier, is that I think it starts with presence. I think it starts with, it's interesting, this whole realm of emotional intelligence, and this is where one of the things that I did a lot of teaching in and training in is what we call mindfulness-based emotional intelligence. That emotional intelligence is a set of competencies, and this is a core part of psychological safety, is the competencies around self-awareness and self-regulation, for example, and empathy, and having those communication skills. But I think it starts with a body practice, right? Training yourself to in some way to not be overreacting or underreacting, right? Fight, flight, and freeze are natural body reactions when we're threatened. So I think a core part of psychological safety is kind of that self-awareness.
Mhm.
Another core part is that building those relationships of trust, and then there's just, I think, having the emotional intelligence, communication skills that we need to make to have real conversations, to build that trust, and these things I think are all very much interrelated with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. That's good points. Good things to reflect on and think about, and I'll continue doing that as well. So, I want to ask one question before we start wrapping up about business settings, workshops that you do, places like Google, engineers, highly technical, technical people. What types of reactions do you get when people show up to a workshop where you're talking about things like mindfulness or Zen?
Well, this is where I think that my job is to be a role model as much as I can. So for me to come in present, for me to meet them where they are, for me to create a safe and energetic space. One of the things that we used to hear, especially in these early days of teaching mindfulness trainings at Google, was it was an opportunity for people to take their game faces off, right? That because Google and many workplaces are, highly competitive, highly stressful. Um, and those can be, competition and stress can be positive if you can feel like you can also be yourself, where
Mm,
you feel a sense of psychological safety, where it's okay to make mistakes, as an example, where
yeah.
mistakes are seen as part of the process. Um, yeah, so I found that there was a tremendous amount of um, hunger
Mm,
for these mindfulness, which in some way I always thought was kind of a code word for being more human in the workplace, bringing in more humanity, which I would say for the past 100 years has been rooted out of the business world. There
mm,
was always this assumption that emotions and humanity were not good for business,
mm,
and I think this was a big aha, not just at Google, but in companies all over the world, that these humans, we need to work together. We need collaboration. We need trust. We need psychological safety. That all these things are essential for business success. They're not impediments to business success.
Yeah. Yeah, and as much as we might stereotype, and I have 2 engineering degrees, and you'd say, okay, well, you label me as like very analytical, quantitative, rational. But I mean, we're all fairly complicated. We all have emotions. Like you said, we may have learned to try to mask or dial back some of that because of what's quote unquote appropriate or safe, in a workplace.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how we need precision in the workplace and we need flexibility.
Mm.
We need confidence and we need humility. So I think, and a lot of what I think people really get from the work of mindfulness, the work that I do, is not avoiding pain, not avoiding difficulty, not avoiding mistakes. Again, all of the work that you're bringing into through this podcast, Mark, this having a different, a healthy relationship with mistakes, with failures, with things that are difficult. This is a core part of the human experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you for what you're doing to highlight that, and what you've shared with us today. Again, Marc Lesser has been our guest. The book is Finding Clarity. I noticed on your website, Mark, that it was endorsed by Professor Kristen Neff, who was a guest on this podcast back in episode 183, talking about self-compassion. So I was happy to see that she's enjoyed your work.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here again, Marc Lesser. I'll put links in the show notes to his website. You can learn more about his work, workshops, different ways he could work with your organization, the book, the podcast. All of that will be in the show notes. So again, thank you, Mark. This has been really, really nice. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.